Egyptomania, an obsession that has intrigued many throughout the ages. For instance, in 1931, Disney produced this little gem. Okay, getting a little more serious. Here's tonight's topics. So what is Egyptomania? And who were the earliest Egyptomaniacs? You might be surprised with the answer. The rediscovery of ancient Egypt, the 19th century Egyptian revival, modern Egyptomania in the 20th and 21st centuries, and finally I'll wrap things up with, believe it or not, Egypt in Denver. Along the way, we'll cover the unabashed and shameless adaptation of the art and architecture of the pharaohs, from palaces to theaters and from cemeteries to coffee mugs. So what is Egyptomania? One dictionary defines it as Western civilization's fascination with ancient Egyptian culture and history. My definition, however, would be that it's a virus that has spread from one civilization to another throughout the ages, infecting many that it came in contact with. Kind of a swine flu thing. In fact, if you've not been bitten by the bug yet, don't sit too close to the person beside you. Obviously, they've probably already been infected, or as Anita said, they wouldn't be here tonight. Well, a few people might respond with, it's just a fad, or who cares? A lot of people do seem to share our fascination with this culture. There's an almost inexhaustible supply of ancient Egyptian-inspired books and magazines, movies, and TV specials, jewelry, drawings, paintings, and posters, children's toys, and yes, there are even adult playgrounds that harken back to the time of the pharaohs. Now let's begin by taking a closer look at the early Egyptomaniacs, those neighbors of ancient Egypt who were first infected by the bug. Ancient world conquest first by Egypt herself into Nubia and Palestine, right in here, and then later into Egypt by Hellenistic Greeks and then Romans, disseminated Egyptian ideas, religion, technology throughout much of the ancient world. One of the early foreign groups that was introduced to ancient Egyptian culture were Egypt's southern neighbors in Nubia. During the chaotic times of the Third Intermediate Period, the Nubians returned to invade Egypt and form the 25th dynasty. Their rule was almost indistinguishable from that of the native-born kings, so perhaps the Nubians were the very first Egyptomaniacs. After the Nubians were overthrown, the Egyptian kings of the Delta city of Sais formed the 26th dynasty. And this dynasty looked even further back than the Nubians had, copying the art of the Old Kingdom days. Other foreign invaders borrowing Egyptian ideas were the Persians. This picture is from the Persian king Darius's palace at Persepolis in Iran. Notice the interesting incorporation of the Egyptian themes above the king's throne. Early classical travelers to Egypt included the historian Herodotus and the geographer Strabo. Pythagoras, the Greek mathematician, may also have developed some of his theories with the help of Egyptian temple priests. These early tourists often left graffiti, which can still be seen today. Many of these visitors decided to settle in Egypt, and they soon adopted Egyptian dress, customs, and religious beliefs. One very important ancient visitor to Egypt was Alexander the Great, who's depicted on the coin in the upper left with ram's horns. He claimed to have been the divine son of the Egyptian god Amun, he was often personified as a ram-headed god. Alexander's city of Alexandria became one of the most powerful places in the ancient world, and her library was home to scholars and inventors for hundreds of years. Everyday Greeks and Romans who lived in Egypt at this time adopted many of the customs of this ancient land, and they were buried in coffins and tombs that had a weird blend of Egyptian and Greco-Roman themes. These tombs contained mummies decorated with elaborately painted masks. Some tombs even had bicultural depictions, such as the scene on the right, which has a dual theme, Egyptian in the upper register and Greek in the lower register. Alexandria's citizens worshipped a strange blend of foreign and Egyptian gods like these. The Ptolemaic god, Serapis, shown on the left, was a compound god with traits of both Osiris and Apis. The Greek god Nilos, the Nile god, is shown in the upper right, surrounded by a sphinx and cherubs. Or stranger still, Horus the Elder, Heru, depicted as a Roman soldier with a falcon's head. During Greco-Roman times, many Egyptian inventions and ideas were exported back to their conquerors' homelands. And this no doubt played a role in the creation of monumental temples and public buildings in Greece and Rome. These foreigners must have been inspired by the impressive buildings constructed by the ancient Egyptians, like this hypostyle hall at Luxor. Egyptian influence can be seen in these examples. Greek temples are shown on the left. The top one is at Segesta, Sicily, and the bottom one is the Nereid Temple from Xanthos, Turkey, now at the British Museum. Roman temples are shown on the right. The lower one is in Nimes, France, and the upper one you may recognize as Trajan's Kiosk on Philae Island in Egypt. Speaking of Philae, another export from ancient Egypt was religion. During Greco-Roman times, worship of the Egyptian goddess Isis became very popular. In fact, many Roman and Greek citizens made pilgrimages to her beautiful temple at Philae, as some of us modern Egyptomaniacs still do. Temples to Isis even spread to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world. On the right is the Temple of Isis on the Greek island of Delos. The upper left depicts the Temple of Isis in Girtashir, Ethiopia, as it looked in 1834. And on the lower left is the foundation of a dual temple to Isis and Cybele, a Mother Earth goddess, at Mogontiacum, modern Mainz, Germany. Isis got around. Interest in Isis was alive and well as recently as 1976, when this TV series aired on Saturday mornings.
"O my queen," said the royal sorcerer to Hatshepsut, "with this amulet, you and your descendants are endowed by the goddess Isis with the powers of the animals and the elements. You will soar as the falcon soars, run with the speed of gazelles, and command the elements of sky and earth." 3,000 years later, a young science teacher dug up this lost treasure and found she was heir to the secrets of Isis. And so, unknown to even her closest friends, Rick Mason and Rennie Carroll, she became a dual person. Andrea Thomas, teacher.
Almighty Isis.
And Isis, dedicated foe of evil, defender of the weak, champion of truth and justice.
The Mummy Study Group has been showing these movies. Other adaptations of Egyptomania included a Roman pyramid built in 12 BC as a tomb for Caius Cestius. The ancient Romans also took great interest in Egyptian statuary. For example, the statue on the right is that of Hadrian's companion, Antinous, portrayed as an Egyptian. Antinous drowned in the Nile while he was accompanying Hadrian on a visit to Egypt in 130 AD. Hadrian then proclaimed Antinous a god, instituted a cult to worship him, and founded the city of Antinopolis at the place where he drowned. As well as incorporating Egyptian art, architecture, and religion, the Greeks and Romans adapted Egyptian technology for the manufacture of glass, ceramics, and metals. The Egyptian artifacts, of course, came first. I've colored their frames blue. You can see them here, here, and here. Followed by the later Greek in green, and then Roman in red, with their copycat technology. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Western Europe disintegrated into small countries which experienced an ebb and flow of unification for almost 1,000 years. During this time, with the exception of a few forays into the Holy Lands and Palestine, the culture of ancient Egypt was essentially forgotten. But Egypt was not lost forever. In the 18th century, a few adventurous European travelers journeyed up the Nile on their way back home from the Holy Lands. They returned with fantastic stories and drawings depicting the colossal monuments of Egypt. This rather fanciful sketch of the pyramids was done in 1712. But perhaps von Erlach, who drew this sketch, had just made a wrong turn and he was actually in Atlantis instead. This slightly more accurate drawing of Egypt is by Pocock in 1743. As you can see, many of these early artists sketched the pyramids with sides that are way too steep. On the left is a drawing by Donati, done in 1759, and on the right is a temple that is larger than life, even for ancient Egypt, drawn by Cassis in 1787. Although the pyramids in this 1798 painting by Hubert Robert look more accurate than those earlier illustrations, the obelisk with dancing girls around it does not look like anything I have ever seen in Egypt. At the beginning of the 19th century, European nations began to take serious interest in Egypt through conquest and colonization in order to control the spice trade. This Egyptian revival pretty much began with Napoleon's invasion in 1798. His stroke of genius was his decision to bring along the savants of the Académie Française to paint and study the archaeological sites. The publication of their work in the Description de l'Égypte helped create the Egyptomania that is still around today. These are two illustrations from the book. The scene on the right is Trajan's kiosk at Philae, which we saw just a few slides earlier. I can't emphasize enough how important this expedition and its publication were. It completely captured the imagination of the Europeans, and it ignited an obsessive interest centered around ancient Egypt. This temple-shaped bookcase was specially made to store the volumes of Les Descriptions in the library at the Benedictine Abbey in Salzburg. Nice piece of furniture. After his 1838 visit to Egypt, Scottish artist David Roberts produced accurate sketches of the ancient monuments, and his illustrations are very collectible today. But beware, many of his prints sold on eBay as originals are actually much later reproductions. Largely because of publications like Les Descriptions and the work of artists like David Roberts, Egypt became a destination on the Grand Tour, the world travels of the idle rich. As there were no hotels along the Nile, wealthy visitors rented dahabeyas, a kind of houseboat, to sail up the Nile to view the monuments. These travelers frequently returned with souvenirs, sparking further interest in Egyptian style. By the way, the illustration on the right is by our own Ellen LeBlanc, showing Bill Petty's restored Victorian dahabeya, which he keeps in Luxor. If you come on next January's trip to Egypt, you too can sail on the Neferu Ra. By the 1870s, cruising the Nile to see the sights of Upper Egypt became a major fad for middle-class tourists. And enterprising companies like Cook's Tours began operating steamships up and down the Nile. This gave birth to the numerous travel posters you can find on eBay, and it turned the smoldering souvenir business into an inferno. Hordes of tourists also meant more customers for grave robbers and looters, and it took a major effort to bring the illegal antiquities trade under control. Looted grave goods would, of course, make their way into the bazaars in Aswan, Luxor, and Cairo. Even today, vendors in stalls stocked with jumbles of statues will often pull out a genuine antique from beneath their counter. But beware, the antiquities police are always keeping a watchful eye. The Egyptians are clever people, however. If they could no longer peddle real grave goods, they would manufacture artifacts and sell them to unsuspecting tourists. Let's now look at the Egyptian revival period in more detail. On their return from Egypt, Western travelers began to incorporate Egyptian themes into their art, architecture, and household goods. European Egyptomania was a fever that rapidly spread across Italy, France, England, and Russia. As well as looking at Egyptomania in these countries, I'll also describe some of the great expositions of the 19th century, which introduced the ancient Egyptian culture to millions of Europeans. And not to be outdone, this mania quickly spread to the New World. So let's begin our grand tour in Italy. Not only are there 8 imported Egyptian obelisks in Rome, there are also 5 ancient Roman copies. Above are 2 of several Egyptian lions in Rome. Roman palaces with sphinxes included Diocletian's palace in modern-day Croatia and Hadrian's villa in Tivoli, Italy. Sphinxes really caught on, and by the 19th century, the icon of the Sphinx guarding buildings began to be seen throughout Europe. Ancient Italy had its share of devotees of the Egyptian goddess Isis. This is the ruins of her temple in Pompeii. And here's a reconstruction of the temple as it probably looked before its destruction by Vesuvius. Much later in Italy, Egyptian mural paintings became popular, like these by Piranesi, which once graced the walls of the English Café. The English Café was located at the Piazza di Spagna, the plaza with the famous Spanish steps shown in the lower left picture. Gardens, like this one at the Stibbert Villa in Florence, began to incorporate Egyptian themes. This garden can still be visited today. Our tour moves on to France. The largest Egyptian object in Paris is, of course, the obelisk at the Place de la Concorde. It was originally erected by Ramses II at the Luxor Temple, but it was moved in 1833 to Paris. Today, the Luxor Temple looks lopsided with its remaining single obelisk. But no doubt, Zahi Hawass is working on the return of the Paris obelisk as we speak. On the right is a statue of Isis, carved in 1779 by Grand Jacquet. It's now on display in Paris's Louvre Museum. While the Louvre is home to many original Egyptian antiquities, one also finds there many examples of Egyptian revival in statues, paintings, and ceramics. The Louvre's biggest example of Egyptomania is, of course, the glass pyramid at its entrance. Also at the Louvre is this painting by Nicolas Poussin. The picture shows the discovery of Moses, although I don't think any ancient Egyptian would recognize his country or the Nile god in this painting. Notice also the Roman-style bridge showing crossing the Nile leading to the pyramid in the distance. Haven't seen that one in Cairo either. This Paris statue was called the Fountain of Regeneration, and it depicted the goddess Isis regenerating the French people. It was constructed in 1793 on the former site of the Bastille prison. And although the drawing makes it look like it was made of stone, it was actually hastily constructed of paper mache. However, some of Paris's Egyptian statues were more permanent. Both the Fontaine du Palmier and the Fountain of the Fella can still be visited today. They were constructed in 1808 and 1812 by François-Jean Braille. French Egyptomania gone wild is illustrated in this 1804 design for a factory to make cannons, complete with 4 pyramid-shaped furnaces. My favorite place for collecting Egyptiana is England. On the River Thames embankment stands an obelisk called Cleopatra's Needle. It was originally one of a pair erected in Heliopolis by Thutmose III, but inscribed about 200 years later by Ramses II. The obelisks were then moved to Alexandria by Augustus in 12 BC and set up in the Caesareum, a temple originally built by Cleopatra to honor Julius Caesar. The picture on the right depicts the London obelisk as it appeared fallen in the sand at Alexandria in 1838. It was moved to England in 1877. The standing obelisk is the other Cleopatra's Needle, which was donated to the United States by Ismail Pasha in 1879, but more about this later. Another obelisk found its way in 1815 to Kingston Lacy in Dorset, England. The obelisk had inscriptions and cartouches with the name of Ptolemy VII and his sister Cleopatra. English scientist Thomas Young recognized the hieroglyphic signs for the letters in the name Cleopatra and Ptolemy, but it actually took the bilingual text of the Rosetta Stone and further work by Champollion before ancient Egyptian writing was finally deciphered. The cannon shown in the top picture was captured in Egypt during the Napoleonic campaign, and it was put on display in St. James Park, London, in 1803. The carriage it sat on was specially made in England, complete with a sphinx, crocodiles, and an image of Britannia pointing the way to the pyramids. You can actually see the little British lion sitting next to her, too. An early example of Egyptomania in England can be found at Buscott Park in Oxfordshire, built in 1779. Obviously inspired by the statue of Antinous, discovered at Hadrian's Villa, Buscott Park had to have its own version. The Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly Street was built in 1812 to house the museum collection of William Bullock. He was an enterprising businessman as he included a bookshop on the ground floor through which customers had to exit to get out of the museum. Some things never change. In 1821, the Egyptian Hall was the venue for Belzoni's recreation of the tomb of Seti I, which he had discovered in Egypt just 1 year before. So his copies of the tomb's artwork were actually very accurate. This 1806 cartoon by Thomas Rawlinson, titled Modern Antiques, satirizes the British enthusiasm for things ancient Egyptian. A woman wrote to the Morning Chronicle newspaper in 1805, complaining that, and I quote, "Since this accursed Egyptian style came into fashion, my eldest boy rides on a sphinx instead of a boat in the shape of a crocodile, and my husband has built a water closet in the shape of a pyramid," end quote. So that pyramid-shaped water closet must have been a sight to see. By the way, if you're wondering what a pap boat is, it's a small dish for feeding pap to infants. Pap is a baby formula, something like oatmeal. Thomas Hope, the man who helped create the Regency style, in 1802 built an Egyptian room in his home in London on Duchess Street. During the 1800s, even the business world wanted this Egyptian style. Egyptian-themed buildings which were constructed in England during the 19th century included Temple Mill, shown in the upper left, a flax spinning mill in Leeds, designed in 1838 by Joseph Bonomi, and the Freemasons' Hall, shown on the right, in Boston, Lincolnshire, constructed in 1863. These structures were built using drawings of the Temple of Edfu, shown in the lower left, made by David Roberts. It seems appropriate that the business of taking care of the dead capitalized on the public's enchantment with all things Egyptian. Here is the entrance to Highgate Cemetery in London, constructed in the 1850s. The avenue leads on past two obelisks to a street of tombs called the Circle of Lebanon, which was built around a huge Lebanese cedar that had been on the property for over 150 years. More Egyptian revival examples are found in these individual tombs in other English cemeteries. This fad spread to America, and Egyptian cemetery architecture became very popular. But more about this in a few minutes. Moving on to Belgium, this Egyptian temple at the Antwerp Zoo was built in 1856. And Russia was not to be left out of the Egyptomania craze. Built in 1825, St. Petersburg's Egyptian bridge was topped with cast iron sphinxes, Egyptian-style columns, and ornamental hieroglyphs. The original bridge collapsed in 1905 when cavalry troops were marching across it. The present structure, incorporating sphinxes and other details from the 19th century bridge, was completed in 1955. There's another sphinx in St. Petersburg at the University Embankment. This sphinx, by the way, is an Egyptian real McCoy and not a copy. It was one of a pair carved for Amenhotep II and brought to Russia in 1820. I'm not sure the Egyptians would have recognized the white stuff that now covers it much of the year. On the grounds of Catherine the Great's palace in Pushkin lies a pyramid designed in 1771 by Scottish architect Charles Cameron. It was used as a tomb for the remains of Catherine's 3 English greyhounds, and there's no historical mention of whether or not the dogs were mummified. Egyptian revival fever was further spread by the 19th century's World Fair expositions. Between 1850 and 1900, there were 20 World's Fairs, and many included entire buildings devoted to the culture of ancient Egypt. I'll cover two of these European fairs, the 1851 London exhibition and the 1867 Paris exposition, and two of the American fairs, the 1876 Philadelphia and the 1893 Chicago World's Fairs. Let's begin with London's Great Exhibition of 1851. The Crystal Palace was a cast iron and glass building erected in Hyde Park. This exhibition could be a whole lecture by itself, but I'll cover a few of its highlights. Designed by Joseph Paxton, a gardener experienced at constructing greenhouses, the exhibition building was 1,850 feet long with an interior height of 108 feet. More than 14,000 exhibitors from around the world gathered in the Crystal Palace's nearly 1 million square feet of space to display examples of the latest technology of the Industrial Revolution. This slide shows Queen Victoria opening the exhibition. Notice how high the ceiling was. Although open for less than 5 months, over 6 million people visited the fair. After the exhibition ended, the building was moved to a new 200-acre Victorian theme park in a wealthy suburb of London called Sydenham Hill. It was opened to the public in 1854. Here's a plan of the Egyptian court at the new Crystal Palace. The mastermind of the Egyptian exhibit was Joseph Bonomi, that man who designed the flax spinning mill we saw a few slides earlier. He had previously accompanied Robert Hay on an expedition to Egypt in 1824, where he'd sketched many antiquities. This is Bonomi's gravestone, complete with, and appropriately, Anubis guarding his grave. The entrance to the Egyptian court was flanked by casts of lions from the entryway of Amenhotep II's temple at Soleb in Nubia. Here's the lions there, and over here. In the outer court, visitors walked past the mummies and then through a facade of Osiris statues from the Ramesseum. Behind the Osiris statues lay a room with a forest of huge Karnak columns. This place was big. Then the visitor moved on to the inner court with its statue of a seated Sekhmet. And behind Sekhmet were adjoining rooms, one with a small-scale reconstruction of the temple of Abu Simbel. Most impressive, however, in the atrium were full-scale replicas of the colossi from Abu Simbel. See them up here? But in 1866, a fire broke out, and the colossal statues were damaged. They were never rebuilt. The entire Crystal Palace was eventually destroyed by fire in 1936. And although there have been numerous proposals in the last 70 years to rebuild it, all that remains of this amazing structure is the park in which it once stood. The Paris Exposition Universelle of 1867 had 50,000 exhibitors, including over 700 from the United States. It was open for about 6 months and received over 9 million visitors. This exposition included an Egyptian temple designed by the famous Egyptologist Auguste Mariette, who was, of course, in charge of the Egyptian Antiquities Service at that time. The exterior of the exhibit included a pylon gateway and an avenue of sphinxes. It had a Ptolemaic facade, a New Kingdom corridor, and an Old Kingdom interior. The interior was filled with antiquities from Cairo's Bulaq Museum. Here's two pictures of the Bulaq Museum, where Egyptian antiquities were stored between 1858 and 1878. Not surprisingly, Egyptomania spread like wildfire from Europe to the Americas in the 19th century. American World Fairs incorporated Egyptian themes, introduced Egyptian themes to millions of people, and Egyptian style began to be seen in New World building architecture. The Centennial International Exhibition of 1876, the first World's Fair in the United States, was held in Philadelphia to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The fair attracted nearly 9 million visitors. There were more than 200 buildings in the exhibition grounds, surrounded by a fence nearly 3 miles long. During the fair, the Turkish delegation passed out samples of marijuana for the first time in the United States, and it became one of the most popular exhibits. Following the European trend, The exhibition also featured a building called the Egyptian Court. An eyewitness named James McCabe wrote that the Egyptian court was not exactly scholarly, but it featured a bewildering blend of the ancient and the modern. As can be seen in these pictures, McCabe was probably right. Stuffed crocodiles, Moorish tables, pharaonic heads, all placed higgledy-piggledy around the room. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893, called the Columbian Exposition, was held to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World. Over 25 million people, that's half the population of the United States at that time, visited the fair during its 6-month run. How's that for attendance? This exposition included a replica of the Luxor Temple, complete with 2 obelisks. The fair also had its own street in Cairo, where one could enjoy the Algerian dancers of Morocco, featuring a dancer named Fatima. Because of her small size, she was better known as Little Egypt. She stole the show, and her belly dancing was referred to as the Hoochie Coochie. This first tune by Sailor Martin uses instrumental music from the song Suez, recorded in 1922.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Little Egypt. Oh, that night in old Cairo, I seen some things I dare not say. She danced a dance of 7 veils, and then her veils fell away. Oh, Little Egypt, what a sight to behold. The men, they threw you coins of silver and gold.
Now, this second singer may be a little more familiar.
I went and bought myself a ticket and I sat down in the very first row. They pulled the curtain, but then when they turned the spotlight way down low, Little Egypt came out strutting, wearing nothing but a button and a bow, singing, yeah, 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 yeah. She had a ruby on her tummy and a diamond big as Texas on her toe. She let her hair down and she did the hoochie coochie real slow. When she did her special number on a zebra skin, I thought she stopped the show, singing, yeah, 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 yeah.
So now you know the story of Little Egypt. The New World was also not left behind in the craze for Egyptian-themed buildings. There's still some surviving examples of early Egyptian revival architecture in America. On the left is the Egyptian Revival Church in Sag Harbor, Maine, constructed in 1834. The steeple was built from drawings of the lighthouse at Alexandria, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And on the right is the Nashville, Tennessee First Presbyterian Church, built in 1848. Another surviving example is the interior of the Grand Lodge of the Masonic Order in Philadelphia. It was built in 1889. The Tombs was an Egyptian revival jail in Lower Manhattan, built in 1838, but it was demolished in 1902. Can't stay there anymore. As previously mentioned, one of the 2 obelisks known as Cleopatra's Needle was given to the United States and erected in New York's Central Park in 1881. Photo on the right was taken in Alexandria, Egypt, just before the obelisk was shipped to America. In 1833, the Washington National Monument Society began a building project that called for a neoclassical flat-topped obelisk surrounded by a circular colonnade in which would stand a statue of George Washington in a chariot. Lack of sufficient funds placed the Washington Monument on hold until 1876. When the project was resumed, it was redesigned as an unadorned Egyptian obelisk with a pointed pyramidion. Completed in 1888, the Washington Monument stands 555 feet tall, with sides made of white marble supported by interior ironwork. The pyramidion top was a very early use of aluminum, cast in Philadelphia and placed on top of the Washington Monument. Within a year, however, lightning had hit the monument and damaged the top, and it needed to be replaced. Standing next to an obelisk in a thunderstorm is probably not a good place to be in case the god Set sends down a lightning bolt out of the blue. May explain why Denver doesn't have any obelisks. One of the most amazing examples of America's obsession with Egyptian architecture was proposed by Franklin W. Smith, the hardware merchant. He planned to build in Washington a great memorial temple to the presidents of the United States in the form of an exact replica of the Parthenon in Athens. 8 large buildings would be built terraced down the sides of the hill below the Parthenon of the presidents. Each would contain the artifacts of one of the 8 great civilizations of the past: Egyptian, Assyrian, Greek, Roman, Byzantine, medieval, Saracenic, and East Indian. To illustrate his concept, Smith erected a prototype in an old skating rink, which he called the Halls of the Ancients. And although huge, it was only a small-scale example of what he intended the National Galleries to look like. The building, whose portal was a full-scale reconstruction of the hypostyle Hall of Karnak, had columns 70 feet high and 12 feet in diameter, and the facade was painted in brilliant colors of red and yellow. The interior included an Egyptian hall of gods and kings, a complete Roman house modeled after those in Pompeii, an Assyrian throne room with casts brought back from Nineveh, and a reconstruction of a Moorish patio from a house in Tangiers. Tragically, the museum was torn down in 1916 to make way for a parking garage. 20th century progress was such a wonderful thing. Other parts of the New World, like Brazil, also caught the Egyptomania fever, focusing on pyramids and obelisks. None of the several dozen obelisks that are in Brazil are actually from Egypt. Rather, they're copies of European pseudo-obelisks, those without hieroglyphs or other Egyptian decorations. The obelisk on the left is in Rio de Janeiro. On the right is an Egyptian-style figure on a balcony further down the same street. In Argentina, a huge obelisk called the Obelisco Buenos Aires was built in 1936 to commemorate the 400th anniversary of the founding of the city. Moving halfway around the world to the other side, Sydney, Australia's obelisk was erected in 1857 and unveiled by its mayor, George Thornton. The monument is actually a sewer vent, and soon the jokers around town called it Thornton's scent bottle. On the right is a Jewish synagogue in Hobart, Tasmania, built in 1833 in Egyptian Revival style. As the 19th century ended and the 20th century began, some important events influenced Egyptomania. For example, excavations in Egypt, especially in the Valley of the Kings. The Art Nouveau and Art Deco movements, both in America and Europe. The discovery of King Tut's tomb was huge. Hollywood naturally got into the act. Tut's traveling exhibit inspired budding young archaeologists, and flea market and eBay finds helped meet the demands of insatiable Egyptomaniacs. British, German, American, and French excavations in Egypt in the early years of the 1900s included well-known Egyptologists like Maspero, Breasted, Budge, Reisner, Borchardt, and a young man named Howard Carter. Their discoveries were regularly written up in the National Geographic and various popular magazines and newspapers, and their stories inspired readers who had never ventured more than a few miles from home. All this publicity fueled yet another Egyptian revival, this one in the 20th century, as the Art Nouveau and Art Deco periods embraced Egyptian themes. Here's an Art Nouveau Sphinx at the De Young Museum in San Francisco. It was carved in 1912. Americans also incorporated Egyptian revival designs in their funerary monuments, like this one, the Dodge Mausoleum in Detroit, built in 1920. And yes, this was the same famous family who built the Dodge automobile. Here's another, the Brunswick Mausoleum at a cemetery in New Orleans. There are many examples in America. Of course, it was the really sensational discovery of King Tut's tomb that galvanized the attention of the world. At that time, almost everybody seems to have been infected with Egyptomania, and the public could just not get enough. The Champollion was one of 3 French luxury liners inspired by the discovery of King Tut's tomb. The ocean liner interiors were decorated with Egyptian themes. The picture on the bottom right shows the Champollion's first-class stairway. With public interest at a fever pitch, advertisers began to use Egyptian themes to sell products. Songs about romantic nights in Cairo, sailing up the Nile, began to be published and performed. And of course, Hollywood caught the fever, and silent films were made starring mummies, pyramids, and tombs. Cleopatra was such a popular character that her story was retold in films over and over again. On the left is a scene from Theda Bera's silent screen version, and on the right is Claudette Colbert's portrayal of Egypt's Ptolemaic queen. The most famous portrayal of Cleopatra, however, was by Elizabeth Taylor in the 20th Century Fox film of 1963. Here's a famous scene from the movie.
Nothing like this has come into Rome since Romulus and Remus.
Timeless classics that have been screened by our own mummy study group have included the 1939 film We Want Our Mummy, starring the Three Stooges, in which they explored the tomb of the midget king Rootin' Tootin' and his queen Hotsy Totsy, and filmed a decade later Mummy's Dummies, where the Stooges were crooked used chariot salesmen. Egyptian-themed movies look better when shown in Egyptian-style movie houses, and many Egyptian theaters were built in U.S. cities. This one is Grauman's Egyptian Theater in Hollywood, California. It's still showing movies today. Not to be overshadowed by California, here are more Egyptian theaters in Delta, Colorado, Boise, Idaho, and Park City, Utah, as they look today. And these Egyptian theaters are in Coos Bay, Oregon, DeKalb, Illinois, and Ogden, Utah. Turning to other 20th century architecture, the Reby Storage and Moving Company of Chicago built an Egyptian Revival style warehouse in 1922. On the right are details of its architectural elements. This building still stands today, so I guess Chicago did not need those additional parking spaces. On the left is the Carrera cigarette factory in London, built in 1926. The building's entrance is guarded by two statues of the Egyptian cat goddess Bastet, and they're flanked with the logos of the cigarette that was manufactured there, the Black Cat. The Home Base store in London, a British version of Home Depot, sports Egyptian columns at its entrance and a mural of Egyptian gods along a side wall. The architect obviously had a sense of humor as he put a power drill in the hand of the god Set. Besides architecture, many other products succumbed to Egyptomania. Some automobiles even had Egyptian themes, like the British Armstrong Siddeley Sphinx. The slogan for Sphinx cars was, "As silent as the Sphinx," and they had an Egyptian Sphinx as a hood ornament. On the French Avion Voisin, notice the winged scarab that is mounted on the radiator, right here, along with an Art Deco Egyptian falcon on its radiator cap. Another famous car was the Stutz, which had an Egyptian head complete with a uraeus mounted on its radiator. And a lesser-known German car, the Steyr, could be ordered with an optional Art Deco Egyptian radiator cap. The Steyr ornament in this photo recently sold on eBay for $30,000. This car, by the way, was featured in The Sound of Music. King Tutankhamun's treasures are among the most well-known artifacts in the world. They've been to many countries, but the best-known exhibition tour was the Treasures of Tutankhamun, which ran from 1972 to 1979. was first shown in London at the British Museum. You might recall T.G.H. James gave an ESS lecture on this exhibit just a few years ago. The exhibition moved on to many other countries like the USA, where it was visited by more than 8 million people. Tut's traveling exhibit catapulted the young pharaoh into the popular culture of the 1970s, and he's still with us today. You might remember this little number by Steve Martin and his backup group called the Tut Uncommons.
Maybe we can all learn something from this.
King Tut. Now when he was a young man, he never thought he'd see people stand in line to see the boy king. King Tut. How'd you get so funky? Funky Tut. Did you do the monkey? Born in Arizona, moved to Babylonia. King Tut. Now if I'd known they'd line up just to see him, I'd taken all my money and bought me a museum. King Tut. Buried with a donkey. Funky Tut. He's my favorite honky. Born in Arizona, moved to Babylonia. King Tut. Tut, Tut. Dancing by the Nile. Disco Tut. The ladies loved his style. Boss Tut, Tut. Rockin' for a mile. Rockin' Tut, Tut. He ate a crocodile. He gave his life for tourism. Golden idols. He's an Egyptian. Now when I die, now don't think I'm a nut. Don't want no fancy funeral, just one like old King Tut. He could have won a Grammy, buried in his jammies. Born in Arizona, moved to Babylonia. Born in Arizona, got a condo made of stoner.
We must leave King Tut, sorry. In the past few years, the fires of Egyptomania have also been fueled by many TV specials on the Discovery, History, and Learning channels, usually starring, of course, he who must always be named. By the way, did you know that Dr. Hawa spent quite a bit of time in Denver as Egypt's liaison during the Ramses II exhibit in 1987? A curious place to find over-the-top Egyptomania is Harrods department store in London. Last year, I could not resist purchasing some of Harrods Belgian chocolates, shown in the box on the right. And here's why. They had an Egyptian theme, which is not really surprising, as they fit right in with Harrods' Egyptian-themed departments, like this one. This is the Egyptian escalator, which runs up through the floors of the building. And at the top of the escalator is a zodiac ceiling, inspired, of course, by the Dendera zodiac now at the Louvre. You might think the face on this colossal statue does not look very Egyptian, but I assure you the face is definitely Egyptian, as is the one on this Sphinx. They're portraits of Harrod's owner, Egyptian-born Muhammad el-Fayed. Now, you don't have to travel to Egypt and dig to amass your own collection of Egyptian treasures, for pharaonic-themed knickknacks abound. They can be purchased from antique stores, flea markets, and, of course, eBay. I ran across this fantastic Sphinx in an antique shop on Portobello Road in London. It opened up to reveal a lovely lady inside. Unfortunately, my wife said it was not on our budget at about $5,000. Now here's some everyday objects of Egyptana that are much more affordable. Top left is an Art Nouveau ceramic tile. Below on the left are adjustable brass bookends. Top right is an Art Nouveau brooch. And the Schaefer and Vader Egyptian Revival mug, shown on the bottom right, is one of my least favorite examples of Egyptana. But the ugliest example I've ever seen is this Royal Dalton two-faced mug of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. I don't think it's a fast seller. Would you believe this unusual Art Deco Egyptian dining set recently sold on eBay for $140,000? Features a two-tier, six-door china cabinet and a dining table and 10 chairs, all inlaid with mythological scenes and hieroglyphs crafted in colored woods, ivory, and mother of pearl. The next slides are a small sample of my personal collection of Egyptana, purchased from various flea markets, antique stores, and eBay. The Sphinx on the top left is actually an inkwell. The Sphinx bookends on the top left are from the Art Nouveau era. The bookend on the lower left and the clock on the right are French Egyptian Revival from about 1880. Top left jars were made around 1920 by a Czech pottery firm called Amphora. The other ceramics are Noritake porcelain from Japan, made around 1930. This metal jewelry box is by Jennings Brothers, circa 1900. The two figures on the left are Limoges boxes, only 3 inches tall. The mummy case in the upper right is an Art Deco mechanical pencil made to be carried on a keychain. And below right is a Zippo lighter from a series showcasing Egyptian gods. I'd like to finish up by taking a look at Egypt in Denver. Many Denverites are familiar with the old Shriners building on Sherman Street. But did you know the building's interior has many Egyptian decorations, like the doorknob on the left and the columns in the second floor theater? And another place to spot Egyptian Revival is at the governor's mansion, where you'll see a Sphinx table and Egyptian-style columns. For genuine Egyptian artifacts, however, one only has to visit our own Museum of Nature and Science or the Denver Art Museum. To help control that disease of Egyptomania, don't forget to attend one of the regular meetings of the ESS or the Amarna Research Foundation. And stay tuned for yet another example of Egyptomania in Denver. There's a proposal to renovate Ryder Square on the 16th Street Mall by adding a glass pyramid at the center of the square. Yes, more mile-high Egyptomania in Denver. I hope you've enjoyed my brief tour tonight of Egyptomania. I'll finish by summarizing with this bit of trivia. According to the late Dr. Frank Yerko, Tutmos III received, after one of his campaigns in Syria, a diplomatic gift of a bird that lays an egg every day. So that would be a chicken. The chicken then first arrived in Egypt in early Dynasty 18. So Egyptomania is alive and well, folks. For more than 3,000 years later, a lady from Brazil would star the Egyptian chicken in a YouTube video. It's got a dancing chicken walking like an Egyptian.
All the old paintings on the
like an Egyptian. Hello. Okay, thanks for your attention. There will be a prize for the best question, so